Good evening. Welcome to Bedtime Stories for Night Owls. Tonight's story is Mr. Bumbletoes Gets Up Early by L.C. Ockenden. When Mr. Bumbletoes came to live in New Tree Cottage years and years ago, Mrs. Rose from the village came out to the cottage to look after him for a few weeks. Those few weeks have now become years, and still Mrs. Rose is doing for him. One day, however, Mrs. Rose received a message that her only sister, who was housekeeper to an elderly gentleman in London, had fallen down the stairs and bruised herself. Mrs. Rose felt very worried about her sister, so Mr. Bumbletoes told her that she must go to London to see her. "Now don't you mind about me," said Bumbletoes. "I shall be able to manage quite well by myself. I will buy lots of tinned peaches and custard powder. Then I shall be able to have fruit and custard every day. In the mornings I'll have fried egg and bacon, and at tea time donuts and ice creams." "That will never do," replied Mrs. Rose. "You will be in Mr. Tweedlecup's surgery on the second day. No, I will make a list of what you are to have every day and what you must buy at the village. You can only have doughnuts on Fridays. They're such indigestible things. Oh dear, I hardly think I ought to leave you after all." "Of course I shall be all right, Rosie," said Bumbletoes. "If only I wake up in the morning." Mr. Bumbletoes was a terrific sleeper. Mrs. Rose always had to hammer on his door to wake him up. He bought an alarm clock once, but he soon found that the loud ringing of the bell did not rouse him. "There you are!" exclaimed Mrs. Rose. "I knew I daren't leave you. You're such a helpless fellow." "No, indeed I'm not," replied Bumbletoes. "You go and pack your bag. I've thought of a new way of rousing myself. Now, you must hurry or you will miss the Arlington train. You have no time to spare, my dear." Mr. Bumbletoes helped her to Bumbleton Station and saw her safely to the train. "Now do take care of yourself," said Mrs. Rose at the last minute, "and don't get up to any pranks whilst I've gone." As the little engine puffed and blew out of the station, Mrs. Rose called out of the window, "Remember, the doughnuts are only for Friday." "Now," said Bumbletoes as he left the station, "I must go and see Albert at Farmer's Mud. I know he passes along the lane at 6:30 in the morning. I'll get him to knock at my door as he passes." He went into the field where they were hoeing potatoes. "Good afternoon, Farmer. I wanted to have a word with Albert, if you don't mind." "Aye, aye," says Mud. "He's over on yon corner." "Now, look here, Albert," said Bumbletoes as soon as he headed to the corner of the field. "I want you to knock on my door as you pass in the morning. If I don't come to the door, you'll know I'm still asleep, so come and shout 'Hello' underneath my bedroom. Then if I don't look out, throw a pebble against the window. I'll throw in a peppermint as a reward." "Oh, aye," replied Albert. "When shall I start?" "Tomorrow morning, Albert," replied Bumbletoes. "Goodbye. I must be off to the shops now." And away he hurried. The next morning came, a beautiful, bright, sunshiny morning. At 6:30, Albert came down the lane whistling and knocked at the door of Yew Tree Cottage. No answer. He knocked louder and louder. Still no answer. He went round to the side underneath Bumbletoes' window. "Hi! Get up, Mr. Bumbletoes! Hi! Halloo! Fire!" shouted Albert. Still there was no reply. Albert threw a pebble against the window. "Hi, Mr. Bumbletoes! Stir yourself, or else you'll be late at the farm." Still no answer. "Oh dear," said Albert. "I must be going." At the last minute, He picked up a stone as big as his fist and threw it up at the window. Crash! There was a sound of broken glass, but Albert could not wait. He hurried on towards Bimbleton. Dear me, yawned Bumbletoes, rubbing his eyes. Was that a bell I heard? What a draught there is in this morning. He sat up in bed and looked out the window. Why, whatever has happened? Who's broken my window? Well, of course, that was Albert, I'll be bound. There'll be no peppermint for you, my lad. Just look at the brick he's thrown in here. Dearie me, I must get up at once. All day long, Mr. Bumbletoes was wondering how Albert could rouse him without smashing his window again. At last, he had a bright idea. He bought a ball of fine string at Mr. Brown's shop, and then went back to Farmer Mudd's to see Albert. Now, Albert, I didn't tell you to come breaking my windows in the morning. I've just had to pay £0.50 for a new pane of glass. Now, I will tell you what I want you to do tomorrow morning. I'm going to tie a piece of string around my toe, and then leave the other end hanging out of the window. When you come by, just give the string a couple of pulls, and I shall wake up. Very good, said Albert. I won't forget. That night, Bumbletoes tied one end of the string loosely round his bedpost and threw the other end out the window. Then he went outside. He cut off the string so it was just about the right height for Albert, and as the string was very light and was blowing about in the breeze, he pulled up a carrot from the kitchen garden and tied this onto the end. Then he went upstairs to bed. He found it wasn't very easy to get the string in between the bedclothes without making a draft, but he managed at length to get the end of the string tied round his big toe. It wasn't very comfortable, but at last Mr. Bumbletoes was sleeping peaceably enough. Then the morning came. It was still very early, and the birds were only just awake. There was a tug at Bumbletoes' toe. Then there was a harder tug, and Bumbletoes woke up with a start. There came a bigger tug still. All right, Albert, all right, I'm awake now, shouted Mr. Bumbletoes. But there was no reply. Instead, the string was tugged more than ever. Poor Bumbletoes threw off the bedclothes and was dragged out of bed by his toe. Hi! Stop! Stop! cried Mr. Bumbletoes, his leg going up in the air as he hopped towards the window. Then, luckily for him, the string broke. He rushed to the window. There was no one in sight. The string and the carrot had gone. Bumbletoes looked back at the clock. Just 6:30. Then he heard Albert come whistling down the lane. As he came up to the cottage, he started in surprise, for there was Mr. Bumbletoes awake. Why, whatever's happened? Cried Albert. How'd you manage to wake yourself so early? Someone has been playing a trick on me, shouted Bumbletoes. Did you see anyone pulling the string? I have only just come up, said Albert. Can I have a peppermint this morning? Well, I suppose so, but I would like to know who's been at my string. All day long, Bumbletoes was puzzling about this strange event. At last he thought of a scheme to catch the intruder. That night he hung out the string just as before, but instead of tying the string around his toe, he looped it round the broken alarm clock which he put on a small table by his bed. Bumbletoes was soon sound asleep. The next morning he was roused with a start. Clatter, bang, clatter, clatter, and the alarm clock bounced and bumped along the floor. Mr. Bumbletoes ran to the window and looked out. Why, there was Sally, the pony, who was always out in the opposite field to graze. In her mouth was the carrot, with the string still tied round it. Bumbletoes gave a pull, away came the string, and Sally trotted off with the carrot. "I've found the thief," said Bumbletoes when Albert came along the road. "It was Joe's pony after the carrot. Tomorrow I'll tie something different on the end of the string." Bumbletoes decided that he would not risk putting the string round his toe. He was still feeling sore, so he kept it tied onto the clock. Instead of the carrot, he weighted the other end of the string with a ball of rags. Now that will give Sally rather disappointment, thought Mr. Bumbletoes, but I can't go on giving her carrots, or she'll be under the window all day and all night, and that will never do. Think what Mrs. Rose would say. He cleaned his teeth and tumbled into bed, and in less time than it takes to tell he was fast asleep, and not even a dream to disturb him. Crash! Clatter! The clock fell off the table again. Bumbletoes awoke, stretched himself, and looked out. There was Sally trotting off, leaving the ball of rag on the ground. Mr. Bumbletoes watched her trotting off, and he couldn't quite bear it. Poor Sally looked so disappointed. "Hi! Wait a minute!" called Mr. Bumbletoes, and pushing his feet into slippers and seizing his dressing gown, he ran downstairs and out through the kitchen, picking up a carrot as he ran. Sally came back when she saw what he held and nearly knocked him down, showing how pleased she was about the carrot. A moment or two later, along came Albert for his peppermint. So for the rest of the week, until Mrs. Rose came back, Sally came every morning to see if there was anything good to eat, and woke up Mr. Bumbletoes. So poor Mr. Bumbletoes had to give a carrot to Sally and a lump of peppermint to Albert, who always called to make sure Bumbletoes was awake. When Mrs. Rose came back and heard all the adventures of the past week, she shook her head and said, "I knew something would happen as soon as my back was turned. Now I shall have to give a carrot to Sally and a peppermint to Albert every morning." The end. Sweet dreams, night owls.